Elizabeth Armstrong's scream echoed through the modest cabin as her husband, William, threw her final possessions onto the dirt outside. Rain pelted the Wyoming Territory that October evening in 1875, turning the ground beneath her feet to mud as she struggled to maintain her balance, one hand protectively covering her swollen belly. "You've shamed me for the last time, Elizabeth." William roared, his face contorted with rage and whiskey. "That child ain't mine, and I want nothing to do with either of you." Elizabeth, barely 20 years old and 7 months pregnant, felt tears streaming down her face, mingling with the rain. "William, please, you're wrong. This is your child." "I've never been with another man." But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The door slammed with such force that one of the hinges broke, leaving it hanging awkwardly, much like Elizabeth's life, now dangling by a thread. She gathered what she could of her scattered belongings, stuffing them into a carpetbag that had belonged to her mother. The small town of Jordan Valley, Wyoming wasn't large, but in this moment, she had nowhere to go. Her parents had died 2 years prior from influenza, and she'd married William Armstrong, 12 years her senior and owner of the general store, partly out of necessity and partly because she'd believed his promises of a good life. Now, as lightning split the sky and thunder rumbled ominously, those promises lay shattered at her feet. "I need to find shelter," she whispered, one hand on her belly as the baby kicked forcefully. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and in her condition, with night falling and the storm intensifying, she knew she couldn't make it. Elizabeth started walking anyway, toward the eastern edge of town where the buildings thinned out and the vast Wyoming wilderness began. Perhaps she could find an abandoned shack or barn to wait out the storm. Each step became more difficult as mud clung to her boots, weighing her down like the despair in her heart. After nearly an hour of trudging through the downpour, Elizabeth's strength began to fail. Her dress was soaked through and she shivered uncontrollably. The baby seemed to sense her distress, moving restlessly within her. When her foot caught on an exposed tree root, she tumbled forward with a cry, landing hard on her hands and knees. "Please, God," she prayed, struggling back to her feet, "don't let my baby die out here." That's when she saw a faint light in the distance flickering through the trees. Hope surged through her, giving her renewed strength. She pushed forward, following that beacon through the darkness. As she drew closer, she could make out the shape of a small cabin, smoke curling from its chimney despite the rain. A lantern hung from a post near the door, swaying in the wind the light that had guided her. Elizabeth approached cautiously, aware that she was trespassing on someone's property, but desperate circumstances left her no choice. With the last of her strength, she climbed the 2 wooden steps to the porch and raised her hand to knock. Before her knuckles could touch the wood, her vision blurred, her knees buckled, and darkness enveloped her. Inside the cabin, Isaiah Reed sat in a chair by the fire, whittling a piece of pine while the storm raged outside. At 30 years old, he'd spent most of his adult life as a cowboy, drifting from ranch to ranch across the Western Territories. 6 months ago, he decided to put down roots, purchasing a plot of land outside Jordan Valley and building this small but sturdy cabin with his own hands. The sound barely audible above the storm caught his attention. It wasn't quite a knock, more like something heavy falling against his door. Isaiah set aside his carving and knife, his brow furrowed. Who'd be out in weather like this? He muttered, reaching for the Colt revolver he kept on the nearby table. While he'd had no trouble since settling here, a man living alone in these parts couldn't be too careful. Gun in hand, Isaiah approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called out. Silence answered him, save for the howling wind and drumming rain. Cautiously, he unlatched the door and pulled it open, keeping his body shielded behind the solid wood. What he saw made him immediately holster his weapon. A young woman lay crumpled on his porch, her clothes soaked through, her face deathly pale. But what shocked him most was her condition. She was heavy with child. "Good Lord," Isaiah breathed, quickly kneeling beside her. He felt for a pulse at her neck and found it weak but present. "Madam, can you hear me?" The woman remained unconscious, her breathing shallow. Without hesitation, Isaiah gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt despite her pregnant state. He carried her inside, kicking the door closed behind him, and gently laid her on his bed, the only one in the cabin. In the lamplight, he could see her more clearly. She was young, probably not yet 21, with dark blonde hair plastered to her face and neck. Her dress was modest but well made, though now ruined by mud and rain. She was beautiful, even in her current state, with delicate features and long eyelashes that rested against her pale cheeks. Isaiah checked her for injuries, finding only some scrapes on her hands and a bruise forming on her forehead. What worried him most was how cold she felt. Hypothermia was a real danger, especially for someone in her condition. "I need to get these wet clothes off her," he realized aloud, then hesitated. Isaiah had never been a man to take liberties with a woman, and the thought of undressing this stranger made him uncomfortable. But he knew enough about cold exposure to understand that leaving her in soaked garments could kill her, and possibly her unborn child, stealing himself. Isaiah worked as efficiently and respectfully as possible. He removed her outer garments and boots, covering her immediately with a thick quilt. He placed her wet clothes near the fire to dry, then stoked the flames higher to warm the cabin. As he worked, he noticed a simple gold band on her left hand. Married then. But what was a married, pregnant woman doing collapsed on his doorstep in the middle of a storm? "Where's your husband, madam?" he wondered aloud, though he expected no answer. Isaiah wet a clean cloth with water from the kettle he kept warm on the stove and gently wiped the mud from her face and hands. Then he pulled his single chair close to the bed and settled in to wait. There was nothing more he could do until she woke if she woke. "Please, God," he whispered, surprising himself with the prayer. It had been a long time since Isaiah Reed had asked the Almighty for anything. Help this woman and her child. Hours passed as the storm continued its assault on the cabin. Isaiah dozed intermittently in the chair, jerking awake at every moan or movement from his unexpected guest. Near dawn, as the rain finally began to subside, the woman stirred more purposefully. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises of striking hazel, and immediately widened with fear as she took in her unfamiliar surroundings. Before Isaiah could speak, she scrambled backward against the headboard, one hand protectively covering her belly. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice hoarse but determined. "Where am I?" Isaiah raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "My name is Isaiah Reed. This is my cabin about 4 miles east of Jordan Valley. I found you collapsed on my porch last night during the storm." The woman's gaze darted around the small cabin, taking in the single room with its stone fireplace, rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and the few personal belongings that marked it as a bachelor's dwelling. Her eyes returned to him, still wary but less panicked. I remember seeing a light," she said slowly. "I was trying to find shelter. You were half frozen and unconscious when I found you," Isaiah explained. He gestured to her clothes, now dry and folded on the table. "I had to remove your outer garments to prevent hypothermia." "I assure you I was as respectful as possible." A blush colored her cheeks, but she nodded. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Reed." "Isaiah is fine, madam. Elizabeth," she offered after a moment's hesitation. "Elizabeth Armstrong, Mrs. Armstrong," he acknowledged, noting how her expression tightened at the title. "May I ask what you were doing out in that storm in your condition?" Elizabeth's hand absently stroked her swollen belly, and Isaiah noticed tears gathering in her eyes before she blinked them away. "My husband." She began, then swallowed hard. "William threw me out. He believes I've been unfaithful, that this child isn't his." She looked directly at Isaiah, her gaze steady despite her distress. "He's wrong. I've never broken my vows." Isaiah studied her face, finding no deception there. Not that it was any of his business either way. I'm sorry that happened to you, Mrs. Armstrong. No one should treat a woman that way, especially not one carrying a child. What am I going to do? She whispered, the question seemingly directed more at herself than at him. Isaiah shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to dealing with women's troubles, let alone those of a pregnant wife cast out by her husband, but something about Elizabeth Armstrong's quiet dignity touched him. For now, he said, standing up, you're going to eat something. Then we can figure out your next steps. He moved to the stove where a pot of beans and salt pork had been simmering overnight. The familiar task of preparing food gave him time to think. Jordan Valley was a small town barely more than a wide spot in the trail with a general store, which, if he recalled correctly, was owned by someone named Armstrong. A saloon, a small church, and a handful of other businesses. People would talk if they knew Elizabeth was staying with him, and her reputation was already at risk given her husband's accusations. Elizabeth watched him from the bed, reluctant to move. When he approached with a steaming bowl, however, the smell seemed to awaken her hunger. She accepted it gratefully. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning, she admitted, taking a careful spoonful. This is delicious. Thank you. Isaiah nodded acknowledgement and returned to the stove to serve himself. They ate in silence for several minutes before he spoke again. Do you have family nearby, someone who might take you in? Elizabeth shook her head. My parents died 2 years ago. I have an aunt in Denver, but… She sighed. The journey would be difficult in my condition, and I'm not sure she'd welcome me with William's accusations hanging over my head. Isaiah frowned. What about the pastor? Surely he could. Pastor Willis is William's uncle, Elizabeth interrupted, a bitter smile twisting her lips. He's already made it clear where his loyalties lie. Isaiah cursed under his breath, then quickly apologized. Pardon my language, madam. Under the circumstances, I think we can dispense with formalities, Elizabeth said, managing a small, genuine smile that transformed her face. For a moment, Isaiah could see the girl she must have been before life's hardships had worn her down. You can stay here, he found himself saying, surprising them both. At least until after the baby comes, I can sleep in the lean-to with my horse. Elizabeth stared at him in shock. You do that for a complete stranger. Isaiah shrugged, slightly embarrassed by his impulsive offer but unwilling to retract it. My ma raised me to help those in need, and it seems to me you're in about as much need as a person can be. Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady when she responded. I can't accept charity, Mr. Reed. Isaiah, if I stay, I need to contribute. Fair enough, Isaiah agreed, respecting her pride. Can you cook? My skills are limited to what you just tasted. I'm an excellent cook, Elizabeth said without false modesty. And I can sew, clean, tend a garden if you have one. I do, Isaiah confirmed. Just started it this spring. It could use a woman's touch. He paused, aware of how that sounded. I mean, I understand, Elizabeth assured him, a hint of amusement in her voice. She sobered quickly, though. But what will people say? A pregnant woman living with a single man. Isaiah had been pondering the same question. We'll tell folks you're my widowed sister, come to stay until your baby arrives. The Reed name isn't known around these parts. I've only been here 6 months and I keep to myself. Elizabeth considered this, her hand resting on her belly as the baby moved visibly beneath her skin. That might work, but what about when people from town see me? Jordan Valley isn't large. How often did you go into town before? Rarely, she admitted. William preferred I stay home or in the store where he could. Keep an eye on me. Something in her tone suggested there was more to that arrangement than she was saying. Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. Then it's unlikely anyone would recognize you from a distance if we're careful. And in your condition, I imagine you'd prefer to stay close to home anyway. Home. The word hung between them, fraught with meaning. This small cabin was Isaiah's home, built with his own hands. It could never be Elizabeth's, not really, and yet she had nowhere else to go. This is very generous, Elizabeth said softly. I don't know how I can ever repay you. Having decent meals and a tidy house will be payment enough, Isaiah assured her, feeling suddenly awkward. He stood, collecting their empty bowls. You should rest more. The storm's passed, but the ground will be too muddy for travel today anyway. I need to check on my horse and do some chores. Your clothes are there on the table when you're ready. Elizabeth nodded, looking exhausted despite having just woken. Isaiah realized the emotional toll of her ordeal was likely as severe as the physical one. Thank you, Isaiah, she said as he headed for the door. Not just for the shelter and food, but for believing me when my own husband wouldn't. Isaiah paused, hand on the door latch. Sometimes strangers see us more clearly than those who think they know us best, he said quietly. Then he stepped outside, giving Elizabeth privacy to dress and process all that had happened. In the lean-to beside the cabin, Isaiah greeted his sorrel gelding, Rusty. The horse nickered softly as he approached. Got ourselves a situation, old friend, Isaiah murmured, checking the animal's water trough and tossing a forkful of hay into the feed bin. Never expected to be housing a pregnant woman, especially not one as pretty as Mrs. Armstrong. Rusty snorted, seeming unimpressed by his owner's predicament. Yeah, I know, Isaiah continued, brushing the horse's coat with long, even strokes. It's not proper. But what was I supposed to do, leave her and her baby to die? As he worked, Isaiah tried to make sense of his impulsive decision. He'd spent most of his adult life avoiding entanglements, especially with women. After losing both parents to a fever when he was 16, he'd learned to depend only on himself. The cowboy life had suited him, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to form lasting attachments. Settling in Jordan Valley had been his first attempt at putting down roots since his parents died. He'd saved enough from years of hard work to buy this land and build the cabin, planning to start a small horse breeding operation. Having a pregnant woman living with him hadn't figured into those plans, and yet he couldn't regret his decision. Something about Elizabeth Armstrong stirred protective instincts he hadn't known he possessed. Perhaps it was her obvious vulnerability or the quiet dignity with which she faced her circumstances. Whatever it was, Isaiah knew he couldn't turn her away, not until she had a safer place to go. When he returned to the cabin an hour later, he found Elizabeth dressed in her now dry clothes, her hair neatly braided, sitting in one of the chairs with her hands folded over her belly. She'd made the bed and washed their breakfast dishes, he noticed, feeling better. He asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Much, she confirmed. Though I'm afraid I've imposed on your only bed. Where did you sleep last night? This chair was comfortable enough, Isaiah assured her, though the crick in his neck suggested otherwise. But I'll set up proper sleeping arrangements in the lean-to. It's weather-tight, just small, Elizabeth frowned. I can't take your bed permanently. Perhaps we could fashion a pallet for me instead, Isaiah shook his head firmly. Not in your condition. You need proper rest, especially with the baby coming soon. At her concerned expression, he added, How far along are you? 7 months or thereabouts, Elizabeth replied. The baby should arrive in early December. 2 months then. Isaiah mentally calculated what preparations they'd need to make. We should get you to see the doctor in town, make sure everything's proceeding as it should. Elizabeth tensed visibly. I can't go into town. William will be watching for me, and if he sees me. She trailed off, her hand protectively covering her belly. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. Is your husband violent, Elizabeth? He asked bluntly. She didn't answer immediately, which told him more than words could have. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He has a temper. Especially when he drinks. A surge of anger rose in Isaiah's chest. He'd seen men who used their fists on their wives before, and he'd never understood it. His own father had treated his mother with nothing but respect and tenderness. Did he hit you? Isaiah pressed, needing to understand what they might be dealing with if William Armstrong discovered her whereabouts. Elizabeth looked down at her hands. Sometimes, not when I was with child until yesterday. That's why I was so shocked when he threw me out. He'd been drinking heavily since learning of the pregnancy, accusing me of infidelity, but I never thought he'd go so far. Isaiah took a deep breath, mastering his anger. Getting furious on Elizabeth's behalf wouldn't help their situation. "All right," he said pragmatically. "We'll avoid town for now. But we need supplies and we need to prepare for the baby's arrival. I know a midwife who lives about 5 miles west of here, Hannah Wilkins. She's discreet and skilled. I'll ride out tomorrow to speak with her." Elizabeth nodded gratefully. "I have a little money," she offered. "Not much. William controlled our finances, but I managed to save some egg money over time." "Keep it," Isaiah advised. "You'll need it for yourself and your child eventually. I have enough saved to get what we need." Over the next week, a routine developed between them. Isaiah worked his land during the day, tending to his small herd of horses and continuing the expansion of his cabin that he'd begun before Elizabeth's arrival. Now, instead of simply adding a proper bedroom for himself, he found himself constructing 2 additional rooms, a bedroom for Elizabeth and the baby, and a separate one for himself. "You don't need to go to all this trouble," Elizabeth protested when she realized what he was doing. "The baby and I won't be imposing on you forever." Isaiah continued hammering a board into place. "Winter's coming. You need a proper place for yourself and the little one, whether you stay a month or a year." The truth was, he'd taken to the idea of expanding his home. The small cabin had served him well enough as a bachelor, but he'd always planned to build something more substantial eventually. Elizabeth's presence had simply accelerated those plans. For her part, Elizabeth proved to be an exceptional housekeeper and cook. Isaiah had never eaten so well, even when his mother was alive. Elizabeth turned simple ingredients into flavorful meals, baked bread that filled the cabin with mouth-watering aromas, and kept everything spotlessly clean despite her advancing pregnancy. She also took over the garden, which had been languishing under Isaiah's minimal care. Under her attention, the vegetables flourished, providing fresh produce for their meals. By the end of October, she'd canned enough to see them through the winter. "Where did you learn all this?" Isaiah asked one evening as they sat by the fire after supper. He was whittling again, this time fashioning a small cradle for the baby while Elizabeth mended one of his shirts. "My mother," Elizabeth replied, her expression softening with memory. She believed a woman should know how to make a home comfortable no matter the circumstances. She glanced up at him, a wry smile touching her lips. "I doubt she imagined these particular circumstances, though," Isaiah chuckled. "Life has a way of throwing the unexpected at us." "That it does," Elizabeth agreed, her hand moving to rest on her belly as the baby kicked. "Would you like to feel? The baby's quite active tonight." The invitation caught Isaiah off guard. Such an intimate gesture seemed improper between 2 people who were, despite their living arrangement, essentially strangers. And yet, he found himself setting aside his carving and moving to kneel beside her chair. Elizabeth took his weathered hand in her smaller one and placed it gently on the side of her belly. For a moment, Isaiah felt nothing. Then a distinct push against his palm made his eyes widen in wonder. "That's remarkable," he breathed, genuine awe in his voice. "Does it hurt?" "Not usually," Elizabeth said, smiling at his reaction. "Though sometimes the baby seems to find my ribs particularly fascinating." Isaiah kept his hand in place, feeling another kick, then another. Something shifted in his chest, a protective instinct that extended now not just to Elizabeth, but to the child she carried. This baby, innocent of the circumstances of its conception and the accusations against its mother, deserved a chance at life, a good life, with safety and love. Realizing he'd allowed his hand to linger too long, Isaiah withdrew it somewhat reluctantly and returned to his chair. "You'll be a good mother," he said with certainty. Elizabeth's smile faltered. "I hope so, I just wish." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Wish what?" Isaiah prompted gently. "That my child could have a father who wanted it," she finished, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "William was so convinced the baby wasn't his that he never even considered, never even gave me a chance to." She broke off, visibly fighting tears. Isaiah felt a surge of anger toward William Armstrong, a man he'd never met but whose cruelty had so profoundly affected the gentle woman sitting across from him. "Some men don't deserve to be fathers," he said finally. "My own father used to say that fatherhood was a privilege, not a right. That any fool could sire a child, but it took a man of character to raise one." Elizabeth wiped away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts. "Your father sounds like he was a wise man." "The best I've known," Isaiah confirmed. "He would have been ashamed of how your husband treated you." They fell silent then, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire burned low. When Elizabeth finally rose to retire for the night, she paused beside Isaiah's chair. "Thank you," she said softly, resting her hand briefly on his shoulder. "For everything." Isaiah covered her hand with his own for just a moment. "You're welcome, Elizabeth." As October gave way to November, the weather turned steadily colder. Snow dusted the ground several times, though it didn't stick yet. Isaiah worked tirelessly to complete the cabin expansion before winter set in properly. And by mid-November, the additional rooms were enclosed and insulated, if not fully finished inside. Hannah Wilkins, the midwife, had become a regular visitor, checking on Elizabeth's progress and preparing for the birth. A motherly woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, Hannah had accepted their story about Elizabeth being Isaiah's widowed sister without question, though her knowing looks suggested she might have her own suspicions. "Everything looks to be progressing normally," she assured them after one visit. "The baby's positioned correctly, and you're healthy despite everything you've been through, Elizabeth." "When do you think the baby will come?" Elizabeth asked, her hands resting on her now prominent belly. "First babies often take their time," Hannah replied with a smile. "But I'd expect sometime in the first 2 weeks of December, based on your calculations." After Hannah left, Isaiah found Elizabeth standing at the window, gazing out at the vast Wyoming landscape stretching beyond their property. Her expression was pensive, almost sad. "Is everything all right?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. Elizabeth sighed. "I was just thinking about Christmas. It will be here soon after the baby arrives." Isaiah nodded. He hadn't given much thought to the holiday he'd spent the last several Christmases alone, sometimes taking an extra shift at whatever ranch employed him so others could be with their families. "We could have a small celebration," he suggested. "Nothing elaborate, but we could bring in a pine tree, make some decorations." Elizabeth turned to him, her expression brightening. "Would you mind? I've always loved Christmas, and it would be the baby's first, even if they're too young to remember it." "I wouldn't have offered if I minded," Isaiah assured her, oddly pleased by her enthusiasm. "We can make it special." As November progressed, Isaiah found himself making trips into town more frequently, purchasing supplies they'd need for the baby and the upcoming winter. He was careful to avoid the general store owned by William Armstrong, instead trading with the mercantile on the opposite end of town. On one such trip, as Isaiah was loading supplies into his wagon, a voice called out to him. "Reed, Isaiah Reed, isn't it?" Isaiah turned to see Sheriff Thomas Blake approaching, his badge glinting in the weak November sunlight. Blake was a fair man from what Isaiah had observed in his limited interactions with the lawman. "Sheriff," Isaiah acknowledged with a nod. "What can I do for you?" "Just noticed you've been buying a lot of supplies lately," Blake commented, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Building on to that cabin of yours from the looks of it." Isaiah's guard went up immediately, though he kept his expression neutral. "That's right, decided I needed more space." Blake nodded thoughtfully. "Also heard from Hannah Wilkins that you've got a widowed sister staying with you now. Don't recall you mentioning family when you settled here." It wasn't quite an accusation, but Isaiah understood the implicit question. In small towns like Jordan Valley, newcomers were always subject to scrutiny, and changes in living arrangements rarely went unnoticed. "My sister Abigail lost her husband back east," Isaiah said, sticking to the story they'd concocted. "She's expecting a child and needed somewhere quiet to rebuild her life." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. Interesting timing, her arrival. You know, William Armstrong's wife disappeared around the same time, ran off, according to him, though there are folks who wonder about that story. Isaiah kept his expression impassive, though his heart rate increased. I wasn't aware. Don't do much socializing in town. No, you don't, Blake agreed. Which is why folks noticed when you suddenly started buying baby things and women's supplies. He sighed, his expression softening slightly. Look, Reed, I don't know what's going on out at your place, and frankly, it's not my business unless someone's breaking the law, but this is a small town. People talk. Isaiah squared his shoulders. My sister needed help and I'm providing it. That's all there is to say on the matter, Sheriff. Blake held his gaze for several seconds before nodding. Fair enough. Just be careful, Reed. Armstrong has influence in this town and he's been making noise about his unfaithful wife, if he got the idea that you were involved somehow. The warning was clear, and Isaiah appreciated it despite the uncomfortable position it put him in. Understood, Sheriff. I appreciate your concern. As the sheriff walked away, Isaiah finished loading his supplies with renewed urgency. The encounter had made it clear that their situation was more precarious than he'd realized. If William Armstrong suspected Elizabeth was at his cabin, there could be trouble and not just social censure. When Isaiah returned home, he found Elizabeth in the garden, harvesting the last of the root vegetables before the ground froze solid. Despite her advanced pregnancy, she insisted on continuing to work, though Isaiah had constructed a seat for her that allowed her to tend plants without kneeling. You shouldn't be out in this cold, he admonished gently, hurrying to take the basket of carrots and turnips from her. I'm perfectly fine, Elizabeth insisted, though her cheeks and nose were pink from the chill. The fresh air feels good after being inside so much. Isaiah helped her to her feet, noticing how she braced one hand against her lower back. Let's get you inside. I need to tell you something. Once they were settled by the fire with cups of hot tea, Isaiah recounted his conversation with Sheriff Blake. Elizabeth's face paled as he spoke. He knows, she whispered when he'd finished, or at least he suspects. He didn't say so directly, Isaiah pointed out, and even if he does suspect, he didn't seem inclined to interfere. Elizabeth wrapped her hands around her mug, seeking its warmth. But if William finds out where I am? Isaiah reached across the small table between them to cover her hand with his. I won't let him hurt you or the baby, Elizabeth. That's a promise. Her eyes met his, filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. You've already done so much for us, Isaiah. I can't ask you to put yourself at risk as well. You didn't ask. I'm offering. He squeezed her hand gently before withdrawing his own. Besides, we're nearly ready for winter. Once the snow starts in earnest, travel will be difficult. We can stay close to home until after the baby comes. Elizabeth nodded, though she still looked worried. What will we do after that? I can't impose on you forever. It was a question Isaiah had been avoiding himself. In the weeks since Elizabeth had arrived on his doorstep, he'd grown accustomed to her presence more than accustomed, if he was honest with himself. The cabin felt like a home now in a way it never had when he lived there alone. The thought of her leaving, taking her child and starting a new life elsewhere, left an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. We don't need to decide anything now, he said finally. Let's get through the winter, get the baby safely delivered, and then see where things stand. Elizabeth seemed to accept this, though her expression remained thoughtful. I've been thinking about names, she said after a moment, clearly wanting to change the subject. If it's a boy, I thought perhaps James after my father, and if it's a girl, maybe Catherine after my mother. Those are fine names, Isaiah approved. Strong names with meaning. As November drew to a close, the first major snowfall blanketed the landscape in white. The cabin expansion was complete enough to be habitable, though Isaiah continued to work on interior details when weather kept him from outdoor chores. Elizabeth's due date approached, and Hannah Wilkins had taken to staying overnight occasionally, not wanting to be caught in a snowstorm when labor began. On the first day of December, Elizabeth woke feeling different. The baby had shifted lower, Hannah explained when she examined her, preparing for birth. It could be days yet, or even a couple of weeks, the midwife cautioned. But things are progressing as they should. That evening, as Isaiah stoked the fire against the bitter cold outside, Elizabeth sat in what had become her chair, sewing tiny garments for the baby. The domestic scene struck him suddenly how natural it felt, the two of them sharing this space, preparing for a new life to join them. In another world, another life, they might have been husband and wife, excitedly awaiting their firstborn. The thought brought Isaiah up short. When had his feelings for Elizabeth changed from charitable concern to something deeper, more personal? He couldn't pinpoint the moment, but he knew with certainty that it had happened. Somewhere between finding her collapsed on his porch and now, Elizabeth Armstrong had become essential to his happiness in a way no one had been since his parents died, and that realization terrified him. Elizabeth, unaware of his internal turmoil, glanced up from her sewing. "Is something wrong? You look troubled." Isaiah shook his head, forcing a smile. "Just thinking about all we need to do before the little one arrives," he lied. "You've done so much already," Elizabeth said warmly. "The cradle is beautiful. I still can't believe you made it with just a whittling knife and some pieces of wood." The cradle had been a labor of love, though Isaiah hadn't acknowledged that fact even to himself until now. He'd carved intricate designs into the headboard, leaves and vines intertwining, with small stars scattered throughout. It had taken weeks of evening work, but the result was something he was genuinely proud of. "My father taught me woodworking," he explained. "Said a man should be able to build the things his family needs with his own hands." Elizabeth's smile was tender. "He would be proud of the man you've become, Isaiah." The sincerity in her voice touched something deep within him. Before he could respond, however, Elizabeth gasped, her hand flying to her belly. "What is it?" Isaiah asked, alarmed. "Should I get Hannah?" Elizabeth shook her head, her expression more surprised than pained. I think that was a contraction. A real one, not just the practice ones I've been having." Isaiah was on his feet immediately. "I'll get Hannah." The midwife had been sleeping in the new spare room. She came quickly when Isaiah called, her experienced eyes assessing Elizabeth carefully. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," she advised after checking Elizabeth. "First babies often take their time. It could be a false alarm, or it could be early labor that lasts a day or more." But Hannah was wrong. Elizabeth's labor progressed rapidly, her contractions coming closer together and increasing in intensity. By midnight, she was fully in the grip of childbirth, and Isaiah found himself banished from the bedroom, pacing the main room of the cabin like the proverbial expectant father. Each cry from the bedroom made him flinch. The sound of Elizabeth in pain was almost unbearable, knowing there was nothing he could do to help her. He'd assisted in delivering foals and calves before, but human birth was Hannah's domain, and he respected that even as he ached to offer Elizabeth comfort, the hours crawled by. Isaiah stoked the fire, made coffee, paced, sat, then paced again. Hannah emerged occasionally to get clean water or cloths, her expression giving away nothing about how things were progressing. "Is she all right?" Isaiah asked during one such appearance. Hannah gave him an appraising look, something like approval in her eyes. "She's doing well. Strong, that one. Birthing is hard work, but she's made for it." Finally, as dawn approached, a new sound pierced the quiet of the cabin, the indignant wail of a newborn taking their first breath. Isaiah froze, his heart pounding as he stared at the closed bedroom door. Minutes that felt like hours passed before it finally opened, and Hannah appeared, her face tired but triumphant. "Congratulations," she said, smiling broadly. "You have a healthy nephew. A boy, then." Isaiah felt a surge of emotion he couldn't quite name. "And Elizabeth?" "Exhausted but well," Hannah assured him. "She's asking for you." Isaiah hesitated, suddenly unsure. This moment felt sacred, private, not something he, as an unrelated man, should intrude upon. Hannah seemed to sense his conflict. "Go on," she encouraged. "Some moments shouldn't be missed, propriety be damned." Taking a deep breath, Isaiah entered the bedroom. Elizabeth reclined against pillows, her face flushed and damp with perspiration, her hair in disarray, and yet, Isaiah thought she had never looked more beautiful. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was a tiny bundle. "Isaiah," she said softly, looking up at him with eyes shining with exhaustion and joy. "Come meet James, James." She'd chosen the name for her father, as she'd mentioned weeks ago. Isaiah approached the bed cautiously, afraid his large frame and rough hands might somehow disturb this perfect tableau of mother and child. Elizabeth shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket to reveal the baby's face. Isaiah's breath caught in his throat. The infant was red-faced and wrinkled, with a smattering of dark hair plastered to his tiny head, and he was the most miraculous thing Isaiah had ever seen. "Would you like to hold him?" Elizabeth offered. Isaiah stepped back, alarmed. "I might drop him." Elizabeth's laugh was tired but genuine. "You won't. Here, sit beside me." Gingerly, Isaiah perched on the edge of the bed. Elizabeth carefully transferred the swaddled infant into his arms, showing him how to support the baby's head. Looking down at James's tiny face, Isaiah felt something shift fundamentally within him. This child, born under extraordinary circumstances to a woman of remarkable courage, deserved every opportunity life could offer. In that moment, Isaiah silently vowed to do whatever he could to ensure James had those opportunities, even if it meant keeping his growing feelings for Elizabeth locked away forever. "He's perfect," Isaiah whispered, gently touching one miniature hand with his finger. Tiny fingers reflexively curled around his much larger one, and Isaiah felt his heart constrict with an emotion he'd never experienced before. Elizabeth watched them, her expression soft. "Thank you, Isaiah, for everything. Without you, I don't know what would have become of us." "Your family now," Isaiah said simply, the words feeling right even as he knew they were a fiction created for the townspeople's benefit. "Both of you." In the days that followed James's birth, a rhythm developed in the cabin. Elizabeth recovered quickly, though Isaiah and Hannah insisted she rest as much as possible. Isaiah found himself taking on tasks he'd never imagined, helping change diapers, walking the floor with a fussing infant so Elizabeth could sleep, even assisting as she learned to nurse her son. Hannah stayed for a week, ensuring mother and baby were thriving before the winter weather made travel between their homes difficult. Before leaving, she took Isaiah aside. "You're a good man, Isaiah Reed," she said plainly. "Whatever the true nature of your relationship with Elizabeth and that baby, I've seen how you care for them both." Isaiah started to repeat their cover story, but Hannah waved him off. "Save it for the townsfolk," she said with a knowing smile. "I've delivered babies for 30 years. I know William Armstrong's son when I see him. That child has the Armstrong chin and brow, clear as day." Which means Elizabeth was telling the truth all along about the baby's father, and William Armstrong is a fool. Isaiah's expression must have betrayed his surprise, because Hannah chuckled. "Don't worry, your secret is safe with me. Just—" She paused, her expression growing serious. "Be careful with her heart, Isaiah. She's been through enough." After Hannah's departure, the little family settled into a quiet routine. December progressed, bringing more snow and increasingly cold temperatures. Isaiah continued to work on the interior of the cabin addition, now with renewed purpose. The room intended for Elizabeth and the baby was his primary focus. He lined the walls with smooth planks, built shelves and a small dresser, and even fashioned a rocking chair that he presented to Elizabeth on the baby's 2-week birthday. "Isaiah, it's beautiful," she exclaimed, running her hands over the polished wood. "When did you find time to make this?" "While you were sleeping," he admitted. "James keeps you up enough at night that you sleep soundly when you do rest." Elizabeth immediately settled into the chair, cradling James to nurse him. The sight made Isaiah's chest tighten with emotions he was trying valiantly to suppress. He busied himself with stoking the fire, giving her privacy. "I've been thinking," Elizabeth said after a while, her voice tentative, "about what happens when spring comes. Isaiah had been avoiding this conversation, but he knew they couldn't delay it forever. "What are your thoughts?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Elizabeth shifted James to her shoulder, patting his back gently. "I can't stay here indefinitely, living on your charity. Once the weather improves, I should make plans to leave Jordan Valley." Though he'd known this moment would come, hearing Elizabeth speak of leaving felt like a physical blow. Still, Isaiah forced himself to respond reasonably. "Where would you go? Denver, perhaps. To my aunt, or further east where no one knows my story. I have skills I could find work as a housekeeper or cook." She looked down at James, her expression soft but determined. "I need to provide a stable future for my son." Isaiah sat in the chair opposite her, choosing his next words carefully. "You know you're welcome to stay, Elizabeth. You and James both. The cabin's big enough now, and I—" He hesitated, then forged ahead. "I've grown accustomed to having you here." Elizabeth met his gaze, her expression complicated. "That's very kind of you, Isaiah, but we can't live in this limbo forever. People will ask questions. James deserves a proper home, a proper—" She trailed off. "A proper father," Isaiah finished for her. The words hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. "Yes," Elizabeth said softly, "though William has made it clear he wants nothing to do with his son." Isaiah leaned forward, his decision crystallizing in that moment. "Marry me." Elizabeth's eyes widened in shock. "What?" "Marry me," Isaiah repeated, more certain with each passing second. "Stay here with me. Let me help you raise James." Elizabeth stared at him, clearly stunned by the unexpected proposal. "Isaiah, you can't mean that. You'd be taking on another man's child, a woman you barely know." "I know enough," Isaiah interrupted. "I know you're kind, hardworking, and brave. I know you're a wonderful mother. And I know that the thought of you and James leaving in the spring makes me feel like I'm losing my family all over again." Tears gathered in Elizabeth's eyes. "But marriage, Isaiah, that's a lifetime commitment. I won't trap you in a marriage of convenience or obligation." Isaiah rose from his chair and knelt beside her rocker, taking her free hand in his. "It wouldn't be just obligation, Elizabeth. Surely you must know that by now," her breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I care for you deeply, in ways I never expected to care for anyone." The admission felt both terrifying and freeing. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, but I'm offering you and James a home, protection, and whatever else you're willing to accept from me." Elizabeth looked down at their joined hands, then at her sleeping son. "There are complications you haven't considered. I'm still legally married to William." "We can resolve that," Isaiah said. "The law provides for divorce in cases of abandonment and cruelty. With the sheriff's testimony about William's claims that you ran away, and perhaps Hannah's statement about the baby clearly being William's despite his denials, we could petition the territorial court." Elizabeth seemed surprised by his knowledge. "You've thought about this before." "I have," Isaiah admitted. "Not the proposal that was more impulsive than I'd like to admit, but the legal aspects, yes. I wanted you to have options beyond just running away to start over elsewhere." Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment, looking between Isaiah and her son. Finally, she spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given us so much already, a home when we had none, support when no one else would offer it, and now you're offering us your future as well." She squeezed his hand. "I can't accept your proposal, Isaiah, not yet." The rejection stung, but Isaiah understood. Of course, it was too soon, too sudden. "No," Elizabeth corrected him gently. "It's not that I don't have feelings for you. I do, feelings that have grown stronger with each day we've spent together. But I need to resolve my past before I can embrace a future with you. I need to be free of William legally, to face him and the town if necessary, so that any life we build together isn't founded on secrets and hiding." Isaiah nodded, hope replacing disappointment. "That's fair. And I'll help you, however I can." "I know you will," Elizabeth said softly, leaning forward to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "That's part of why I've come to care for you so deeply." Christmas arrived with a fresh blanket of snow and a clarity to the air that made the world seem newly made. Isaiah had kept his promise to make the holiday special. A small pine tree stood in the corner of the main room, decorated with paper stars Elizabeth had cut, strings of dried berries, and a few glass ornaments Isaiah had purchased in town before the heaviest snows began. They exchanged simple gifts. Elizabeth had sewn Isaiah a new shirt and knitted a warm scarf, while he presented her with a silver locket he'd ordered specially from the mercantile, along with a small wooden horse for James, though the infant was far too young to appreciate it. "For when he's older," Isaiah explained as Elizabeth admired the perfectly carved toy. "Every boy should have a good horse, even if it's just a wooden one to start." The day passed peacefully, with a special dinner of roast rabbit and the last of the preserved garden vegetables. As twilight fell and James slept contentedly in his cradle, Isaiah and Elizabeth sat before the fire, cups of hot cider in hand. "This has been the best Christmas I can remember," Elizabeth said softly, "despite everything or perhaps because of it." Isaiah smiled, watching the firelight play across her features. In the week since James's birth, a new confidence had emerged in Elizabeth. Motherhood suited her, and the knowledge that Isaiah cared for her seemed to have given her additional strength. "The first of many," he said, then added quickly, "I hope." Elizabeth's smile was warm. "I hope so too." They had agreed to delay any further discussion of marriage until spring, when travel would be possible again, and they could address the legal complications of Elizabeth's existing marriage. In the meantime, they continued as they had been, sharing the cabin but maintaining separate sleeping quarters, raising James together, and allowing their feelings for one another to develop naturally. Winter deepened, bringing storms that howled around the cabin and temperatures that froze the creek solid. Isaiah ensured they had ample firewood and that the livestock were properly sheltered. Elizabeth kept the cabin warm and inviting, cooking hearty meals and caring for James, who grew stronger and more alert with each passing day. In quiet moments, when the baby slept and chores were done, they truly talked, learning each other's histories, hopes, and fears. Elizabeth spoke of her childhood in Ohio, her parents' decision to move west for her father's health, and the devastating influenza that had claimed them both, leaving her alone at 18. Isaiah shared stories of his own parents, his years as a drifting cowboy, and his eventual decision to settle in Jordan Valley. "I never expected to stay in one place again," he admitted one evening in late January. "After my parents died, nowhere felt like home. And now?" Elizabeth asked, her gaze steady on his face. "Now home isn't a place," Isaiah replied simply. "It's wherever you and James are." February brought slightly warmer days, though winter still held the land firmly in its grip. On a particularly clear day, when the sun reflected blindingly off the snow, a sound neither of them had heard in months caught their attention: the approach of a horse and rider. Isaiah was outside immediately, rifle in hand. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In winter, with snow still deep on the ground, they were virtually unheard of. The rider came into view around the bend in the trail that led to the cabin, and Isaiah recognized Sheriff Blake's sturdy form atop his gray gelding. He lowered his rifle but remained alert. "Sheriff," he called as the lawman drew closer. "Unexpected to see you out this way in winter." Blake dismounted, his expression grave. "Reed, is Mrs. Armstrong here with you?" The direct question caught Isaiah off guard. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded. There seemed little point in denying it now. "She's inside with her son." Blake exhaled heavily. "I need to speak with both of you. It's important." Isaiah led the sheriff into the cabin. Elizabeth was standing near the fireplace, James cradled protectively in her arms, her face pale but composed. "Sheriff Blake," she acknowledged quietly. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Blake removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Elizabeth. "Mrs. Armstrong." "I'm not here to cause trouble for either of you. In fact, quite the opposite." Elizabeth and Isaiah exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean?" Isaiah asked. William Armstrong is dead, Blake announced without preamble. Found him this morning in his store. Doctor says it was his heart, probably brought on by the amount of whiskey he'd been consuming these past months. Elizabeth sank slowly into a chair, her expression a complex mixture of shock, relief, and something like grief. Dead, she repeated softly. I don't know what to say. There's more, Blake continued. Before he died, he wrote this. He withdrew a folded paper from his coat. It's addressed to you, Mrs. Armstrong. I took the liberty of reading it, given the circumstances. Elizabeth handed James to Isaiah before accepting the letter with trembling fingers. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the page. Whatever it contained caused her breath to catch, tears welling in her eyes. He apologizes, she whispered, looking up at Isaiah in disbelief. Says the drink made him crazy with jealousy, that deep down he knew the child was his, but couldn't bear the thought of being a father when his own father was so cruel. She continued reading, her voice growing stronger. He asks forgiveness he knows he doesn't deserve and says I should consider myself free to find happiness wherever I can. The room fell silent save for James's soft cooing. Blake cleared his throat. There's a legal matter to consider as well. Armstrong left a will recent, by the look of it. Names you as his sole heir, Mrs. Armstrong. The store, the house in town, his savings, it's all yours. Elizabeth looked stunned. But why, after everything he said, everything he did? Guilt's a powerful motivator, Blake suggested. Or maybe in the end, he remembered the man he was before the drink took hold. Isaiah found his voice. What happens now, Sheriff? Blake replaced his hat. Officially, I came out here to notify the next of kin of Armstrong's passing, whether Mrs. Armstrong chooses to claim her inheritance is her business. He fixed Isaiah with a meaningful look. And whatever arrangement you two have here is none of my concern, or the town's, now that there's no wronged husband to consider. After the sheriff departed, promising to return when the weather improved to help with any legal matters, Elizabeth and Isaiah sat in stunned silence, James sleeping peacefully in his cradle. I never wished him dead, Elizabeth said finally, still holding the letter. Despite everything. I know, Isaiah assured her, reaching across to take her hand. You're not capable of that kind of hatred. What do we do now? She wondered aloud. Everything has changed so suddenly. Isaiah squeezed her hand gently. Not everything. My feelings for you and James haven't changed. My offer stands if you want it. Elizabeth met his gaze, her own clear and direct. I don't want William's store or house. I never belonged there, but I do want to be free of the past to build something new. She turned her hand in his, intertwining their fingers. With you, if you're still certain. More certain than I've ever been of anything, Isaiah assured her. But there's no rush. Spring will come and we can figure out the details then. Elizabeth rose from her chair, still holding his hand, and drew him to his feet. Standing close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, she spoke softly but with conviction. I've lived with uncertainty and fear long enough. Life is too short and too precious to delay happiness when it's within reach. Before Isaiah could respond, she rose on tiptoes and pressed her lips to his, their first kiss, sweet and tentative but filled with promise. Isaiah responded gently, cradling her face with his free hand, pouring months of unspoken longing into the gesture. When they parted, Elizabeth's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright. I love you, Isaiah Reed, not just for saving us, but for the man you are, kind, honorable, patient, the kind of man I want beside me for the rest of my life, the kind of father I want for James and any other children we might have. Isaiah's heart felt too full for his chest. I love you too, Elizabeth. Have for months now, though I tried not to. Why? She asked, genuinely curious. Didn't want to take advantage. Didn't think I had the right with everything you were going through. He smiled ruefully. And I was afraid of caring that much again, of potentially losing another family. Elizabeth rested her hand on his chest over his heart. We can't promise forever, no one can, but we can promise to cherish whatever time we have together. In that moment, With the winter sun streaming through the windows and James sleeping contentedly nearby, the future seemed as bright and clear as the snow-covered landscape outside. Spring arrived gradually, the snow melting to reveal muddy ground that slowly firmed and greened. As soon as travel was reasonably safe, Isaiah and Elizabeth rode into Jordan Valley with James. They had business to attend to legal matters regarding William's estate, which Elizabeth had decided to sell, keeping only a few personal items and distributing the rest of the proceeds among the town's poorest families. Their appearance together caused a stir, of course. Elizabeth held her head high as they walked down the main street, James bundled in her arms. There were whispers and stares, but also nods of greeting and a few kind words from those who had never believed William's accusations. Pastor Willis, William's uncle, avoided them entirely. But Hannah Wilkins made a point of embracing Elizabeth publicly and cooing over how James had grown. Sheriff Blake tipped his hat respectfully as they passed. Slowly, it became clear that the town was willing to accept the new reality the widow Armstrong had found protection and eventually love with the quiet rancher east of town. By late April, all legal matters were settled. William had indeed left everything to Elizabeth, and the store had sold quickly to a young couple from Cheyenne looking to start a new life. With her share of the proceeds, after the charitable donations she'd insisted upon, Elizabeth had enough to contribute significantly to the ranch she now shared with Isaiah. They were married on the first day of May, in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who served the outlying homesteads. Hannah stood as Elizabeth's witness and Sheriff Blake as Isaiah's. James, now 5 months old and growing stronger daily, watched the proceedings from Hannah's arms, occasionally punctuating the solemn words with happy gurgles. "I never thought I'd find this," Elizabeth confessed that night as they lay together as husband and wife for the first time. "After William threw me out, I thought my life was over. I couldn't see how anything good could come from such despair." Isaiah drew her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Sometimes the darkest moments lead us exactly where we need to be." Through the open window, the spring air carried the scent of new growth and possibility. On the bedside table, the deed to their property lay signed with both their names, Isaiah and Elizabeth Reed, equal partners in all things. "I'm going to use some of the money to buy breeding stock," Elizabeth had announced earlier that week. "If we're going to build a horse ranch, we should do it properly." Isaiah had been stunned by her declaration. "You want to stay here, build the ranch with me." Elizabeth had looked around at the cabin, their home, with clear affection. "This is where our story began, where James took his first breath, where I learned to trust and love again. Why would I want to be anywhere else?" Now, as moonlight spilled through the window, illuminating Elizabeth's face as she drifted toward sleep in his arms, Isaiah felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. From the lowest point in her life, pregnant, abandoned, facing an uncertain future, Elizabeth had found the strength not just to survive, but to build something beautiful. And he, who had spent years avoiding attachment, had found a family worth risking his heart for. In the next room, James slept soundly in the cradle Isaiah had carved for him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to build the life they'd chosen together. The house would grow as their family did. Isaiah was already planning additions to accommodate the children they hoped would join James in the years to come. "I love you," Isaiah whispered to his sleeping wife, marveling at how those simple words could contain such depth of feeling. Elizabeth stirred slightly, nestling closer in her sleep. Outside, a night bird called to its mate, and somewhere in the distance, one of their horses nickered softly. Isaiah closed his eyes, embracing the peace of this moment and the promise of all the moments to come. The pregnant woman thrown from her home had found not just shelter but a true home, with a man who had built her a better life than she had ever dared to dream possible. Their love, born of compassion and grown through shared purpose and mutual respect, would continue to flourish in the home they had created together, a home built not just of wood and nails, but of second chances, unexpected joy, and an unwavering commitment to the family they had become.